Welcome, Dr. Pran Yoganathan, to the Low Carb Lifestyle Long Weekend. Thank you so much for joining us.
Perfect, Tracy. Thank you for inviting me to speak today with you.
Oh, it's such an honour, and there'll be many people watching that know you and obviously follow you on Instagram. If you don't follow Dr. Pran on Instagram, please make sure you do. It's very funny and informative. I love the posts that you do. I love what I've learned from you. But, you know, obviously you're a gastroenterologist, so I don't want to go too much into that. There's all the information below for people who want to get to know you a little bit more. But I wanted to start by asking you, apparently 2,000 years ago, Hippocrates said that all diseases begin in the gut. I wanted to ask you, was he right?
Look, he probably wasn't too far from the truth, to be quite honest with you, Tracy. There's, I mean, when you consider a lot of the modern illness that we face in the modern age, a lot of it we speculate is driven by our lifestyles, obviously sedentary lifestyles, but in particular our diet as well. And when you consider the gut is basically a conduit for all that stuff that we're consuming, yes, I think it makes sense that the damage fundamentally is coming from within. Of course, we have genetic nuances and inter-individual variabilities and so forth, but I think when you consider chronic illness in general, of which diabetes and obesity and blood pressure and all these sort of things kind of make up the bulk of that, and the umbrella that they fall in under is metabolic syndrome, I think a lot of that is coming from our diet, and of course the gut's intimately tied with that. In addition, some of the more mysterious aspects of the gut is its immune function as well, and a lot of autoimmune illness nowadays that we face, and there's a lot of speculation that that too could be mediated by the gut, in particular something called intestinal permeability. And I think we're starting to get some fairly reputable scientists in the field speaking about intestinal permeability as potentially a mediator for a lot of these autoimmune illnesses. So I guess Hippocrates was right all along, right? And it's the wisdom of the ancients.
Yeah, awesome. I'd love to come back down further on in the chat and talk to you about the autoimmune side of things. But maybe could you just start with helping people understand, you know, when we talk about gut function, so what are we actually talking about here?
The human digestive tract is essentially a conduit for food, and during the journey that food takes from the very start, which is in our mouth or oral cavity, down to the rectum, which is the reservoir for holding stool, that is a journey that food goes through, and it's a series of events that cleaves it into its absorbable forms and converts it into energy substrates. That is basically the function of the digestive tract. If we were to look at it purely from a energy balance perspective. So the human digestive tract, the journey begins in the mouth. Obviously we masticate. Actually, for us as humans, well, it begins before it even gets into the mouth, because we do things like fermentation, we do things like soaking, we do things like pounding, grinding, milling, flour, all this sort of stuff. And for meat, obviously cooking it. So we as humans are very, very specialized as a species because we do that. No other species does it. So we break it down into an easily absorbable form or easily accessible form even before it hits our mouth. And when it hits our mouth, we masticate, we chew, we break it down further. And there are even enzymes in our mouth like salivary amylase, which break down starches in our mouth. And that's an adaptation which has occurred in the last sort of 10 to 15,000 years, where amylase amplification has resulted in us being able to have increased tolerance to starchy foods, primarily because of agriculture and the role that it played in that time period. But once it's in the stomach, this food is then broken down further by stomach acids. In particular, protein requires stomach acids to break it down into its kind of absorbable form. And then we release it into our small bowel. The small bowels are very, very specialized 4 meters of tissue, which is made up of brush border, so things like villi. So this increases the surface absorption capacity of the gut. And so this is where the absorptions occurred for proteins, for fats, for starches, And then it enters the colon, where the bacterial populations get to work and primarily start fermenting these foodstuffs for themselves, and they release us or some of that energy source, which we also take. So that's called fermentation type digestion. And the colon primarily, that's the role, is to ferment, to absorb liquid, and to act as a reservoir for stool, for waste, basically, which we then expel.
So how do we know then if it's not functioning optimally? What are the signs that, things aren't going right?
Well, I think most people know, right? Like, there's an absolute epidemic of reflux, of irritable bowel, of constipation, of diarrhea, of, perianal symptoms, which are, things like anal fissures, hemorrhoids. I mean, these are all reflections of a human digestive tract that's not working well. In fact, I would put down things pertaining to oral function and dentition, things like caries and enamel wear and things like that, as potentially relating to digestive function. So I think diseases such as that kind of indicate that a person's gut function can't be appropriate. In addition, we know that when one is diabetic or obese, their microbiome takes on a very pathogenic as in diseased sort of a signature. So the microbiome is so fluctuant and prone to change that essentially if general health isn't great and your digestive function in terms of your gut symptoms isn't great, it's probably a reflection that your overall gut health isn't crash hot.
So if it changes quickly, does that mean that it can be fixed pretty quickly as well?
Good question. Yes, I think it is possible to repair our gut microbiome, but it really comes down to a few things, right? We inherit our gut microbiome from our mothers, in particular through the journey through the birth canal, right? Like, as we come out through this birth canal, we are in contact with mother's perineum. We then inherit her gut flora. Now, in the modern era, especially with cesarean sections being so prevalent, that aspect of it is being taken out. In addition, the mothers are kind of carrying a poor microbial signature as well. So it's this constant passage of a poor signature down to their children and their children's children. So essentially what I'm trying to get at is every generation's gut health is essentially declining. And that is a function of epigenetic change, right? So it's not as easy as, well, we go on a detox diet or go on a specific diet and fix things. It's far deeper than that. As a species, our gut health is declining, and that is being brought about by a modern environment which is extremely sterile, devoid of infection, antibiotic use, and a food environment that is on another level artificial, essentially, in the sense that we as humans kind of created it and we perpetuate our existence within it. So, what chances have we got, I guess, is what I'm getting at. And I don't mean to sound cynical, but I think the long-term picture, if we're looking at it from an intergenerational perspective, it is a worrying trend. And that's not surprising. We're seeing childhood allergies at an all-time high. We're seeing autoimmune illnesses in children younger and younger. We're seeing autoimmune diseases that generally happen in adulthood happening in children. We're seeing childhood obesity. All of this is a function of the microbiome, which is the brain that controls our gut. Very, very hard to change it in terms of what we're sort of set out with. But I think through willpower and through appropriate changes in person's lifestyle, yes, it is possible to change, but it has to be kind of countered with it. It takes time. It takes time to breed out a specific population of bacteria and reculture a new one, right?
Yeah, right. So does that mean, it's not simply a case of, obviously eliminating certain foods out of your diet is important, but, we can't just throw probiotics at the problem. It sounds like it's going to be a much bigger and longer term kind of solution, because if you see probiotics everywhere, I know that's kind of I love your view on probiotics. Do they help? But, I just think people are going to sit there and listen to that and go, wow, because I know personally, like 4 of my 5 kids, they were born by cesarean, and it is what it is, right? You know, I can't change that. And one of my children was peanut allergy, very, very young, picked up some peanut butter from my 2-year-old, and he was only like 7 months old and had this big reaction, did the test, yes, peanut allergy. But then, you know, I kept breastfeeding him, and he had another test at 18 months and it was gone, right? So there was no allergy anymore. So, you know, no one's been able to tell me, you know, I kind of said to the specialist, you know, well, what happened there? Did he just grow out of it? He said, oh, no, but I was actually putting probiotics on my nipple before I was breastfeeding him. And, you know, I don't know whether it worked or not, but, you know, sorry, there isn't really a question there, but just
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. I think, look, and I'm not knocking cesarean sections. Like, one of the biggest contributors to our lifespans increasing is obstetric care. You know what I mean? Like, young mothers dying in childbirth fundamentally was a massive contributor to why our average lives was so short, or considered short, especially in hunter-gatherer groups. You know, we talk about average age being 30 or 40 in these groups. Why is that? Because a lot of these children died during childbirth, and these poor mothers as well. So obstetric care is one of the true fields of medicine that we have to respect and admire, because it's made a huge difference. So yeah, I mean, it is what it is, as you said, with the cesarean sections. But with regards to probiotics, the data is very scant on it, to be quite honest, Tracy. There's no good data that it helps. I tend to explain it to people as, you know, our gut microbiome is made up of trillions of organisms, 40 to 60 trillion. You know, some of these probiotic capsules contain 1 billion organisms. So, you know, it's like trying to change the color of the ocean with a glass of, you know, orange water. It's very, very difficult. That there's this huge dilution effect that comes into play. So probiotics, clinically, there is actually no data for it. But as you can imagine, a baby's microbiome is so young, so naive, so potentially you could have changed the microbial signature with those probiotics that you were administering to your baby. It's just kind of an evidence-free zone.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, what an area of science. So there must be so much that there's some things we know, but so much we don't know, you know, when it comes to the gut. But then, of course, like most things, people talk about this in the space as, you know, there's so much black and white science. So, you know, I'd love to sort of talk to you about what we do know. So for example, continuing on the vein of babies. So we have children, we breastfeed them if we can, or they go to formula. And then traditionally, then they're put on rice cereal and a whole lot of, you know, starchy carbs and things like that as their first foods. What's your thoughts on that? I mean, is that really optimal, considering that we know if we're eating any species, it should eat what it's evolved and adapted to eat for health? Is that what our hunter-gatherer babies would have gone from, breast milk to rice cereal?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Tracy. I think the human babies are extremely energy hungry species. I mean, our brains are absolute freaks in the animal kingdom, right? Like, so this is why the human baby is delivered relatively early and relatively helpless, because the skull capacity is far too big to fit through the mother's birth canal. Our brains are normally big, right? And so we deliver this baby, and the brain, which is a very, very energy hungry organ, it has to rapidly grow. So we've got milk, which is a perfect blend for energy, with high levels of fat and high levels of carbohydrate and protein, of course. So it's got all 3 macronutrients scattered through, and we then breastfeed. Of course, for factors, and this is controversial, I don't want to put my foot in it, but for in a lot of these ancient cultures, the babies kind of just keep breastfeeding, do you know what I mean? And there's no cutoff limit. There's a cutoff limit now in the Western world because of, well, it's just the way we are. It's not a matter related to convenience, but often parents work and there's busy jobs and busy lives. So a woman can kind of give herself, I guess, to the baby for a defined period of time in terms of breastfeeding, but then culturally we've defined a set point as in, well, this is when it ends, right? But what I'm trying to say is in a lot of these cultures, the babies continue to feed beyond what we would accept as kind of the norm. I remember my father telling me his father breastfed till he was about 4. The mother had other babies, but he just kept breastfeeding, and it was normal. And in fact, a lot of hunter-gatherer groups, you'll find that it's not only the mother breastfeeding the baby or the child; it's all the mothers in the group, right? And so if we're talking about what we're adapted to do, this is what we're adapted to do. So I guess to go back to your original point of weaning onto rice cereals and so forth, the baby remains energy hungry, their brain remains energy hungry. It's just the modern environment in which we exist where the breastfeeding has ceased potentially. You've got to introduce energy. So rice cereals are a form of energy, as is anything else that's introduced, artificial milk, whatever. These are just energy sources and the brain will take that up. But the question is, should we really be introducing protein a little bit quicker into it as well? Good quality protein, I think it'd be good, but obviously weighing up whether the baby's at risk of choking and things like that, whether their teeth have come through and how confident the parents are. But I think we've got to be very, very careful in pushing a low carbohydrate message about children because their brains really require quite a lot of energy to amplify and grow. They're growing beings. Do you know what I mean? So I think for children, we should be trying to push as much as possible unrefined carbohydrates, unrefined fats, unrefined proteins, like keep it whole foods based. That's my opinion on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with you. I mean, I think, keeping processed foods out of our kids' diet is really what we can all do as parents as best we can. I mean, just looking again in my little micro, experiment with my kids, my first 3, I had no idea, and they did the traditional rice cereal. I could only breastfeed 2 of them. 1 was formula, all that sort of stuff. I only did what I knew. But for my last 2, they went from breast to like mince and bone broth and, just completely different because I had different knowledge then and I knew different. And, it's not like I've ever, pushed low carb onto my children because, as you said, I mean, they're very different beings to what adults are who are, I was metabolically unhealthy. My diet looks very different. And I love explaining that to my kids, when, I'm eating something different or I'm fasting or something like that. So I think it is really important. I really like how you said that, it's not about low carb for children. It's about, obviously as much real food as possible, making sure they get a lot of energy, but also not fearing real food like, meat and proteins and stuff like that. Because there must be, we know how important protein is for our overall health. So that is important too when they're little. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Protein's non-negotiable. I don't think it is, but unfortunately, we're seeing a modern world with the modern madness that percolates within it. That is, kind of pushing this message that protein's somehow detrimental to health. I've seen headlines saying that protein contributes to childhood obesity and so forth. And we only have to see the horrific newspaper headlines where parents have trialed restrictive diets, in particular protein restrictive diets on their growing children with absolutely horrible results. Protein, that's non-negotiable. It's what we're built with. It's the building blocks for our bodies, and it builds everything from muscle, bone, brain to also enzymes and enzymatic functions, hormones, all of it. So it really, that can't be negotiated. Children need a lot of that. And quality protein in particular, animal source protein in terms of its digestibility, its absorbability, all of those factors it's chalk and cheese compared to plant protein. It's far superior. I don't think anyone can argue with that. Any scientist can argue with that. We can get people wrapped up in their ideological beliefs who may try and argue, but any good scientist will tell you that there is a clear difference, and the data reflects that.
Yeah, definitely. I've got, I'm going to come back to that topic on meat, because there was a question I wanted to ask you about that. But I was hoping I could ask you, so getting back to adults now, so if someone comes to you, Pran, and they've got something like IBS, which is a very, very common symptom that a lot of people suffer with, are you able to kind of, just give an idea on what, you would advise in terms of healing or, that type of thing?
One of our prestigious journals, the American Journal of Gastroenterology, stated following a survey that about 75%, 60 to 75% of the presentations to a gastroenterologist's office was for irritable bowel syndrome. Of those, that high proportion of people, 99% of it was related to diet. And I agree with that. I think irritable bowel syndrome at its core is a dietary issue. So I find it difficult to label people with a label like irritable bowel. If it's primarily related to lifestyle, to me, it doesn't make sense. I'd rather look at modifying lifestyle. We know for diseases or conditions like irritable bowel, there's a diet called a low FODMAP diet, which at its core is a low carbohydrate diet, right? Which reduces the fermentable carbohydrates in the diet, the fructoses, the fructances, the lactoses, the polyols. These compounds are poorly absorbed by the human gut, and we all have a difference in terms of our tolerability to it. Largely speaking, a lot of people struggle with it. Now, when these sugars, if they can't be absorbed, they end up in the colon. In the colon, they're fermented, excessively fermented. And there's a huge byproduct of gases, the sulfites, the nitrogens, the hydrogens. There's a bloat generally that follows, and we know now, based on a lot of scientific analysis, that if there is gas within the gut, it impairs motility. It can contribute to reflux. It can contribute to constipation, diarrhea. So this, I think, is fundamentally what's contributing to this epidemic of irritable bowel. I think it's our diets that contribute. So I think we should look at kind of tweaking the diet. So what I tend to do is I tend to get a symptom a presentation from the individuals that come in to see me. Oftentimes it's they all kind of coexist together. The bloating, the reflux, the erratic stooling, they all coexist together. And oftentimes if there's issues with constipation and the person has hemorrhoids, bleeding. So I kind of describe it as a constellation of gastrointestinal symptoms. And then we get a dietary history. I try and take a detailed dietary history with all my patients. And then I often will book them in for endoscopies and colonoscopies, depending on if I think that there's possibility of structural lesion in this modern world where we're seeing 20 and 30-year-olds with colorectal cancer traits. I very rarely take risks anymore. I kind of book them in for scopes, largely speaking. And if their scopes are negative and their biopsies are clear for things like celiac disease and so forth, and Crohn's, I will generally sit them down in rooms and talk to them about modification of their intake of fermentable carbohydrates. And look, I'm lucky enough to work with Jessica Turton, Tom, Nikki, and Kieran, who are all dietitians. I know that you know them well. They all work in the Centre for Gastrointestinal Health with myself. We work as one big team. It's great to be able to refer on to those guys, and a lot of patients see really good results. Is there data for low carbohydrate diets in the setting of irritable bowel syndrome? Very little, believe it or not. So hopefully we can publish some prospective and retrospective data on that. We're looking forward to do that when we get the time.
Yes, that thing called time. So moving on then from that, there's a lot. I mean, obviously there's a big carnivore movement going on at the moment, and I've been carnivore. I'm pretty much 90% carnivore myself, and that happened when I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's about a year ago, which is kind of why I want to come back to the autoimmune side of it too. So how would it's certainly seeming to have helped me. It seems anecdotally to help a lot of people with various issues. I certainly am very wary about it being the panacea of everything, which I think some people might think it is. But I'd be very fascinated in your view as to why just eating an all-meat diet could potentially heal something like autoimmune. Is it just a case of taking out all the bad things?
Yeah, I think so, Tracy. I think there's probably a little bit more to it than that, but I think you hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of anecdotes of people on a standard Australian Western diet who've gone whole food vegan and kind of reversed a lot of illnesses as well, right? It's the same thing. Like, a lot of it just comes back to the processed stuff. There's no doubt that there's so many processed elements within our diet that contribute to ill health. The issue that I've always had with a whole food plant-based diet is just so much more difficult to access these nutrients due to a lot of the anti-nutrient compounds in plants. In addition, there's just so much nutrients that's locked up in fibre, which we struggle to access. So look, I'm not against a plant-based diet. It's just I think the science of it doesn't quite add up to me. With regards to why this carnivore movement's been so popular, the thing with it, Tracy, is that fundamentally most of those foods, in particular red meat, which these dietary groups tend to gravitate towards, they're so nutrient dense, Tracy. The chances of running into any sort of nutrient deficiencies is fairly low. Red meat's a very nutrient dense food. In addition, things like liver and so forth, and organ meats, which a lot of people in this community tend to consume, very, very nutrient dense. So it is an attractive diet from that perspective. Are we built for that diet? Well, we can touch on that in a bit of time. But and part of the reason why a lot of people see improvements in their autoimmune illness, it's essentially fundamentally an exclusion diet where they've taken out things like emulsifiers, whilst excessive amount of fructose in their diet, refined sugars, alcohol, toxic stuff, and we know the way some of these cereals and grains are prepared now, that there's a high content of glyphosate in some of these foods. So essentially, by doing these type of restrictive diets, we've just eliminated all of that. In addition, you've got a diet that fundamentally contains the essentials for life. So people tend to do well on that, and in addition to that, it's very, very satiating. It's a high satiety type food, so a lot of times people are just never hungry or hardly hungry during the course of the day. So there's also that aspect of, because it's high satiety and high thermic effect of food as well, which means that the body has to work hard to break down the protein and incorporate it into the body. People expend calories just breaking down the digestive material, which is protein. So people fall into, I hate using the term, but in fact, a lot of people on a high protein diet will fall into a caloric deficit. If one is in a caloric deficit, you'll have to burn fat for energy. And burning fat for energy is probably very good because we know ketones do tend to have an anti-inflammatory component to them. So there's many, many ways in which that diet could potentially help people. On the flip side, though, the same can be said for specific people with whole food plant-based diets, where they're eliminating the breads and the pastas and the refined stuff. And I have seen people improve on that. I can't argue with their anecdotes either.
Yeah, right. Okay, so is it, what I'm interested in then is that, do we heal when that happens, or is it, do we make do we heal to a point where we don't want to ever reintroduce any foods, or, I don't know, I get this whole, well, does our gut become weaker, or does it become stronger when we eliminate, Do you know what I'm trying to say with that stuff?
Yeah. No, I wish there was a way to measure intestinal permeability, but intestinal permeability is probably the hypothesis that underpins a lot of modern autoimmune illnesses. Is the concept that the junctions between the cells of our small intestine have basically become loose, and the damage from that is thought to come from gliadin and wheat-based protein, also fructose, also emulsifiers, alcohol, other foreign substances in our food. And if the tight junctions between these cells are loosened, well, the barrier that is the gut then becomes permeable, as in it leaks, right? And so it leaks bacterial antigens and bacterial lipopolysaccharides, and leaks food components, lectins, all of this into our system. And there's many schools of thought to say that, well, this is what stirs up the immune system. Now, it makes sense to me that if you're eliminating those foods, you're fundamentally looking to heal the gut. But I don't think it's a rapid process. I think it takes probably many weeks to months to perform. And I can't argue with the anecdotes that I'm seeing clinically with a lot of inflammatory bowel disease patients that are trialing this sort of restricted diet and going into remission. Of course, I don't recommend it as first line because the science doesn't support it. But for those that want to trial a lifestyle-based management plan rather than going straight on to immunosuppressive medications, I don't think it's unreasonable if they're not desperately unwell to trial some lifestyle changes. And I can't argue with what I'm seeing.
Fascinating. Can I take it back then to your question, well, to the comment you made, when we're talking about carnivore, is it, I'd love to know, are we evolved to eat that way?
It's very interesting. Our journey is super interesting, Tracy. 4 million years ago, we were a fruit-eating, tree-dwelling, leaf-eating creature, in the rainforests of Africa. But in that 4 million years, we've taken some twists and turns along the way. A lot of it's been driven by climate change and huge shifts in our environment, which have driven us to eat things that we necessarily may not have. But the interesting thing was this primate creature that started adding foods that it was scavenging, such as fats, to the diet. It was essentially the nutrient density in its eating pattern went up. As the nutrient density went up, the brain capacity rose. And as the brain capacity increased, the foraging behavior became more complex. So it's kind of in this positive feedback loop, right, where the brain's growing because of the food, but then as the brain grows, then it becomes smarter at seeking the nutrient density. And so we go from fruit eater to a scavenger to fundamentally then a hunter, which is Homo erectus, which is the vast majority of our period of evolution is spent as Homo erectus, 2 million years in fact. And Homo erectus is thought to be a hyper-carnivorous ape. So carnivorous, in fact, they were killing and eating even carnivorous animals and consuming their liver and developing crazy diseases such as vitamin A toxicity from eating carnivore liver. So it's a very carnivorous ape. And this was the first ape that perfected long distance running for persistence hunting. So we still carry a lot of those vestigial aspects of Homo erectus. But Homo sapiens, which started emerging about 230,000 years ago, still very heavy consumption of meat, huge hunters. But I think we started slowly becoming more diverse in our diet, more adaptable, because what happened to Homo erectus is that it fundamentally died out because essentially there were changes in climate. So because we know that Homo sapiens and Homo erectus coexisted together, the two species existed together, even though we're an offshoot of Homo erectus. But Homo erectus died out and we didn't. Why is that? It's thought to be secondary to our adaptability. It was the same with the Neanderthals. Homo sapiens was just a different breed of primate. So this is why I try not to get too ideological or religious about my dietary choices, because we're just built to take advantage of any situation. And we know where the nutrient density is. It lies in meat and large megafaunal creatures. But if the opportunity arose, we would take it from elsewhere. And this is how we fundamentally led to the advent of agriculture 10 to 15,000 years ago. So to answer your question, are we carnivorous? We are. But we are best described, and I've said it before, as cookinivores, as we cook. We cook and we extract energy. But if you were to ask me where does the human gut lie on the spectrum of the animal kingdom, I'd say we lie somewhere between a creature such as a pig, which is an omnivore, in between a pig and a dog, which is a carnivore, but will also eat some plant material. So we're really in that spectrum of carnivory, we're really quite high up there. but we're not a total carnivore. If we were, we wouldn't have things like the taste buds to appreciate sweet things, which we've got in abundance. And, animals such as the lions, they don't have that. And that's why they don't, there's nothing that draws them to any sweet food, but we've got it. That shows us that we are that omnivorous type of eater. In addition, we have bittersweet tasting ability, which is that we will taste something. If it's bitter, we'll generally spit it out. And that ability is thought to confer protection against sampling toxic plants. So if something was excessively bitter, we've interpreted that as probably poisonous, not consumed it, or if something was more tolerable. So that's where we lie. We shouldn't become overly ideological about we're 100% plant-based or 100% meat-based. We very much somewhere in the spectrum of, animal-based, but with a bit of plant food.
Fantastic. And I think that's where it gets really exciting for people to work out for themselves, because, certainly, I've got Hashimoto, so I try and avoid things like lectins and obviously, gluten and all that stuff I've had out of my diet for a long time. But I only sort of in the last year discovered, that all the greens that I was eating was probably, and all the nuts and all that stuff was probably not the best thing, for me. But, I think, as you say, it's there is a spectrum, and there isn't a one size fits all diet, and, where we all lie, we have to kind of work it out for ourselves. But if we take it back to what you said in the beginning when I asked you, so what are the symptoms of suboptimal gut health? Well, if you've got those symptoms, then you can do something try and do something about it and tweak your diet around and give it a go and see if things change. Because I think it's, that's to my next question. If you've just talked about, we're probably an omnivorous eater, but our diet today and I guess what we eat generally and what people eat overall, it's just changed so much, hasn't it, recently? I mean, and there's so much processed food and there's so much takeaway food and packaged food, and we've got seed oils and all this stuff. So how do we work out, what we should be eating, given all the information that's out there, rightly or wrongly? How do we work it out?
So I look at it this way, Tracy. Carbohydrate actually is a non-essential macronutrient. I think it's good to have some carbohydrate in the diet, in particular nutrient-dense carbohydrates. There's a big difference between a bowl of pasta and a sweet potato. Do you know what I mean? It's they're two very, very different things, yet in some of the low carbohydrate spaces they can be considered the same thing. I think that they've got to be separated out. The quality of the carbohydrate matters, and the quality of the nutrients contained within these carbohydrates matter. I think it needs to be weighed up for the individual. Say for a diabetic, perhaps a sweet potato is not the greatest option. They're better to substitute something else, but for a fit young person with plenty of lean muscle, very low body fat mass, I think carbohydrates are fine, depending on the quality of it. Now, to go back to the question of, where does that leave us? I think all of us as human beings, we've got, every animal, in fact, every mammal has got a protein target for the day. Protein is key, right? And protein is basically the building block. So nature determines that we have got a set point for protein. And we're all slightly different, I guess. A bigger person carrying a lot more body mass in terms of muscle would have a higher set point of protein. A male might have a higher set point of protein to a female because of just generally the larger body mass and larger muscle quality. So we've got this protein set point, but we're in a situation where quality protein, which comes from animals, seafood and eggs and things like that, and red meat, of course, our protein intakes are so abysmally low that there's this gap of hunger, basically. So there is this need for this creature to seek out energy, right, in that setting. This is called the protein leverage hypothesis, because we're under-eating protein and we're surrounded by a food environment that is so rich in refined fats and refined carbohydrates. We're over-eating those things and essentially running into issue with protein deficiency. And so I think if one maximizes the intake of quality protein, both from animal and plant-sourced foods. Animal-sourced foods obviously being more superior in terms of their nutrient quality, digestibility, leucine content, and so forth. You run into this situation where there is satiety. You're just not craving all the time, and then that remaining percentage you could make up in other foods such as fats and carbohydrates and so forth, but getting the right amount of proteins paramount. And that's what we try to work out with our team of dietitians is, well, what is the protein requirement for this individual? And it varies, of course, with age. As you age, it goes up. And so we look at it from that perspective. Protein really is king.
Yeah. And just so people are aware of that, because generally what we eat declines as we get older. Certainly, it's a big issue for the elderly. But as we know, and you've talked about it, it's so important to keep up the protein to avoid things like sarcopenia and all that, those horrible illnesses. So yeah, very, very important. Now, I'm really conscious of the time. I need to let you go. I'm hoping I could just end with a couple of,
Yeah, sure, Tracy.
Your quick thoughts on a few controversial topics, and if you can, do it quickly.
Sure, yeah, no problems, yeah.
So the first one we touched on red meat, and obviously you've talked about, and look, so many people in the summit too have talked about the importance of red meat. I've got a whole presentation on red meat and cancer, but it is such a pervasive and controversial topic. First of all, does red meat rot in the colon, and is it, certainly for polyps and all that sort of cancer down in the gut, is it red meat?
Good question, Tracy. We, as I said, we start digesting red meat before it even hits our mouth. We do that with fire, basically, or heat. Once it's in our mouth, we tear it open, we chew it, we deliver it to our stomach. Once it's in the stomach, the acid gets to work. We cleave these amino acids into smaller, they cleave these protein molecules into smaller amino acids and smaller chains. Once it's then delivered to the small intestine, the enzymes digest the meat even further. So we keep breaking it down to a point where it's all absorbed within the small intestine. It never makes it to the colon. Very little animal source foods will make it into the colon. So the fact that people say that it rots in the gut kind of speaks volumes about that individual's ignorance rather than any clear science.
Great. And if that's the case, because that's interesting too, because I certainly know people when they do eat more meat, if there's not that much going through, then of course their bowel habits change a little bit. And because that brings me to the next one that's controversial topic is fibre. Is there a quick summary on that in terms of fibre?
Sure.
Do we need it?
Yeah, sure, Tracy. Sorry, I forgot to answer your original question as well about red meat and cancer, but I'm sure one of your other speakers, I think it's Dr. Alex, is touching on that. I saw that he was presenting as an important topic, and I'm sure Alex will do a fantastic job there. Essentially, the data that's linked to red meat and cancer is pretty weak. It's fairly weak based on really bad epidemiology. So I think one of the biggest risk factors for colorectal cancer, any cancer in general, is diabetes, metabolic syndrome. It's being obese, it's having hypertension, it's being generally metabolically unhealthy. So I think the diet that allows you to regain your metabolic health is unlikely to be contributing to colorectal cancer, right? So whichever path you tend to take it, if that's through red meat, I don't think it's an issue. Of course, if you overeat calories and you overrate red meat beyond satiety, which is pretty difficult to do, and you're over-consuming calories, all that stores as visceral fat, you're going to have issues there. Do you know what I mean? You can still develop metabolic syndrome, and I think that's a risk factor. So do I think red meat's contributing to colorectal cancer? I don't. Do I think excess calories is contributing to colorectal cancer? Absolutely, I do. I hope that answers the first aspect of your question. With regards to fibre, again, it comes back down to flexibility, right? Like, we have to be flexible at all times. We've got these bits of kit in our body which are evolved for a certain thing. So fibre, whilst it's not a nutrient or a essential thing for us, it probably is something that the bacteria in the hindgut do require, because that's a substrate for them to basically feed on. I think people have to be careful with the quality of fibre that goes in. A lot of times people, when they consume insoluble fibre, can end up with a lot of gut symptoms. But things that are soluble fibre, again, I don't think it needs to be overdone particularly, but soluble fibre can be a good substrate for your hindgut bacteria just to keep them kind of engaged and doing a job, because it's important for us to be flexible, because we are evolved and built at a time where any form of energy was critical. But a point that I'd like to make is that the amount of energy that we extract from fermenting fibre and non-absorbed carbohydrates in our hindgut and colon is only thought to be about 5 to 7%, which is extremely low when you compare it to animals such as that are hindgut absorbers, like the horses, where they get most of their energy, 50% of their energy, from fermentation. Okay, so this is the thing. The question is, where are we supposed to get the rest of our 90% of our fuel? And I've spoke about nutrient-dense foods, quality protein, quality fats, and quality carbohydrates.
Just can you give me some quick examples of soluble fibre? So what would you be talking about there?
So something like psyllium husk is an example of soluble fibre, and that's why a lot of people utilise it with a lot of bowel-based issues. Interestingly, though, if you overconsume psyllium husk, it can set like concrete within your gut. And I've definitely noticed, that there is some variability in how people tolerate it. Some people do better with a little bit of fibre in their system. Other people actually don't tolerate fibre very well. And paradoxically, those that tend to get a lot of slow transit constipation, fibre may not be the appropriate thing for them. A lot of these people have actually trialled high fibre diets and will tell me in rooms when they come to see me as patients, I don't want to be put on a high fibre diet. It hasn't worked for me before. In fact, it's made things worse. And there's some small data sets showing that excessive fibre consumption, actually withdrawal of fibre from people's diet, can sometimes be beneficial, which doesn't surprise me.
Well, fascinating stuff, Dr. Pran. I'm going to let you go. I'm so grateful for you. And I know there's people watching this going, Tracy, you should have asked him this, you should have asked him that. You know, it's such a fascinating topic, and there's just always so much we can learn about it. But, you know, you've shared so much great stuff today. I can't thank you enough. It's just been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracy. It's an absolute pleasure. It's a minefield of many opinions and recommendations, but I think we've just got to get out there, move our body, and eat in a way that fuels our muscles and organs, and we should kind of all practice mindful eating, as in we should understand what a human diet entails and where we've come from, and that's kind of what I'm all about.
Yeah, you are. What a great way to